Welcome back to Questions for the Rector. I'm your host, Stephen Heiner, and with us, as always, is the Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary here in Reading, Pennsylvania, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn. Hello, Your Excellency.
Hello.
Well, as you know, within the last few days, Tucker Carlson has interviewed Vladimir Putin, and I told you when I saw it that you would enjoy it. You had a chance to listen to it on a long drive. What were your first impressions upon listening to this interview?
Well, it's obvious that Mr. Putin is an intelligent person. He's also well informed. In other words, he knows his history. He is well informed even about economic things. I mean, he spoke off the top of his head about many things that were informational. I mean, just things that he obviously reads a lot. He keeps up with things. It was embarrassing that he would be the president of Russia, and that our president is someone that doesn't know who he is or where he's going. It was really embarrassing when I listened to him. So, in that sense, I had a good impression of him as a well-informed, intelligent person.
People like you and me who enjoy history might have really enjoyed that first 30 minutes in which he gives this discursive talk about Russian history, but it turned off a lot of people. Apparently, a lot of people said it was boring. They didn't continue on. And there's some conspiracies as to whether this was intentional or not. But I want to leave that aside and just get into the history itself. I wouldn't call this a fact check, but we do want to talk about each of these points. So 988, Vladimir adopts Orthodoxy.
Yeah, he was baptized as a Greek Catholic because Orthodoxy didn't exist until 1054. So-called Orthodoxy. In other words, the Greek schism did not exist until 1054. So this is about 100 years before. That's a long time. That's, for us, it's the 1920s. And so yeah, he was off on that. I picked that up right away, that was false. And Russia was originally, therefore, a Catholic country, and so was Ukraine, a Catholic country, because it was under the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was in union with Rome.
Poland was trying to create a fringe people called Ukrainians in their adjoining territory.
Well, I'm not familiar enough with that claim, or it's generally true that there was a lot of, let's say, moving around of borders during that time. The Lithuanians and the Poles occupied a great deal of what is Ukraine now, but that's Europe. I always say that the best job to have in Europe and the most lucrative would be a map maker, because European borders have changed constantly over the centuries. So to say that, well, it was Lithuanian or it was Polish, and, I really thought was off the point, because, Belgium was part of the Netherlands, so, but then it split off, and then the French had it for a while. It was Empire of the French. And the Alsace-Lorraine belonged to Germany, and then it became France, and then it became Germany again. That's Europe. So I mean, to say that there were shifting borders, to me, was irrelevant.
I do think part of it was he wanted to, in some ways, paint the Poles as one of the bad guys in the situation. That they were trying to bring our people over to Catholicism. We were Orthodox, and, the Poles had their influence there. So I think part of it is he does want to make the Poles into somewhat of an antagonist here.
Yes, he wants to paint Russia as an originally Orthodox, and by that I mean schismatic country. It was not. And that it was holding out against these. He wants to paint the Ukrainians as Russians. That was the whole point of that whole historical thing. And that the Poles were imposing their Catholicism on these Orthodox people, and and then it came to a big head. There was a big war with the Poles, and in the Russians. And there's actually a big monument in Red Square. The Poles got as far as Moscow, and there was some big battle, and the Russians pushed them back. And there's a monument to that fact, and I saw it in Red Square. I mean, yeah, he was basically accurate in his historical facts as far as who was beating up whom. But the point of that 30-minute lecture, which was interesting to me, you know, I like history, was that the Ukrainians are really not a separate people from the Russians. And nor is it really a separate country from Russia. That was the point of it. And I would like to hear the other side, let's put it that way. I think that was a stretch.
Another point he made, which I laughed a little bit when I heard, under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed its historic territories. And I thought, how did that happen exactly?
Well, the Russians always wanted to take over Constantinople and make that a Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, whatever, some sort of Orthodox patriarchate and center, and drive out the Turks. That was high in the mind of Russians for many, many centuries. And they always strove to do that. And so Catherine the Great invaded that part of the Turkish Empire, which was southern Russia, and took Crimea. That's how Crimea was added to the Russian Empire. Now, did the Ukrainians or whoever the ancient pre-Muscovite, because when you say Russians, you're talking about Moscow, you know. But there's a pre-Muscovite period. Did Ukraine belong to them? Did the Turks take it? I don't know. I perhaps so, but. You know, when something belongs to you for a couple of hundred years and nobody makes war on you, it's hard to make the argument, well, now we're going to take it back. You know, there's various cases like that in history of the world. If there's something
the English have had Gibraltar for a very long time, and there's lots of close to Father Esposito's home, I suppose, Las Malvinas, also known as the Falkland Islands. People hold land for a long amount of time.
There's something known as prescription, and that is if you hold it for a long time and nobody says or does anything, you have it. By moral law, you have it. See, so I think you could argue prescription on that for the Turks. I mean, they took it and nobody did anything. Nobody defended it. And so, again, I thought it was a bit of a stretch to say, you know, we picked it up again. And the implication is that Ukraine also belongs to Russia and we're just taking it back. That was the implication. I mean, you know, so... I don't agree with that.
Another thing, I think you said your jaw dropped when you heard this, that Russia was careful about the people and religions of those who were incorporated into the empire.
Oh, I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe that he would say such a thing. The Catholics that were in the Russian Empire were always persecuted. There was Peter the Great actually killed a priest, a Lithuanian, I think it was Lithuanian priest, just killed him. Because he was Catholic. And the Catholics were very oppressed in the Russian Empire. As a matter of fact, so oppressed were they that when Kerensky took over and the Tsar was gone in 1917, the Catholics were extremely happy because they could have their Corpus Christi processions in the street, that the oppression was over. Nicholas II did a great deal of oppressing of Catholics, and Nicholas I oppressed the Catholics in Poland, which was part of the Russian Empire, and the Poles revolted against him. They oppressed the Jews. My goodness.
I wondered, why was it that 1 million Soviet Jews immigrated to Israel? Yes. Why did that happen? Was it because life was so great in Russia?
No, the Tsars were constantly persecuting the Jews, and Stalin persecuted the Jews a great deal too. I mean, they were no better off under Stalin. So, I mean, to say that was just an absurd statement, you know, as if Russia was always peace-loving with all religions. It's just not true.
he basically asserts a historic claim to Ukraine that supersedes recent nation-state borders. He calls it an artificial state because it also includes parts of Hungary and Romania. He gives testimony of this. He also says Lenin inexplicably awarded territories to Ukraine that had no historic tie to Ukraine. Once again, this narrative is Ukraine's an invented state. Those are not natural borders of a state that existed with the people that inhabited it.
Well, again, shifting borders of Europe. I mean, you can't say that because borders have shifted, therefore it's a false state or it's an artificial state. You can't say that. That's ridiculous. The also inexplicable. Why did Lenin give those away? And it's true that they are ethnically and religiously Russian, the Donbass region, that southeastern part of Ukraine. That's true. And it is unexplainable why Lenin would do that, but he did it. And he was the head of state of Russia. He was the soul of the revolution of Russia. I mean, his body is lying in state in Red Square, and it is protected by soldiers. It's as if he's some kind of a saint.
You've seen this
I've
yourself.
seen it, yes.
Well, thanks to the Germans, that's how we got Lenin.
Yeah, so so I mean, to say, oh well, to pass over that as if it were nothing. Here he gives away this very important part of Russia to Ukraine, and why? But the fact is, he gave it away. He gave it. And it's theirs, and it was theirs from 1924, I think it was. No, let's around that time, say 100 years ago, they had it up until now for 100 years, and nobody said anything about it. No one objected to it. Stalin never objected to it. Nobody objected to it. I mean, that's prescription. That's you have it, and so I thought that was disingenuous for him to put it that way. Then he did not even mention the fact that Khrushchev gave away Crimea to Ukraine. Just gave it to them, even though Sebastopol is their main naval base, because the Baltic naval base gets often frozen over, perhaps not in recent years, but they can't count on that. Also, they're Baltic, that means up by St. Petersburg. They have to go through, in a wartime scenario, that whole northern piece of sea, you might say, or water, through by Germany, by all of these potential enemies.
It's the GIUK line.
England and France to get out into the Atlantic Ocean. So, I mean, that is they could be wiped out in no time. So Sebastopol, which is part of Crimea, is a very important port for them. And why Khrushchev would give that away, and also understand that in the Constitution that was given to the Soviet Union by Stalin in the 1930s, it explicitly states that any of those republics, I think there's 16 republics of the Soviet Union, could secede at any time they wanted. And that was confirmed again in 1984 by a new constitution. So, he glossed over all. He didn't mention any of that. And nor did, what was his, Tucker? Is that his name?
Carlson, yes.
Ask him that. I mean, he didn't do his homework.
He wasn't prepared on that part, certainly. No. Now, in his defense, he said that he really just wanted Putin to talk the whole time. He wasn't there to do the interview in which he says, I'm a better person than you, and you're a war criminal. So he just wanted to let Putin talk.
No, but I mean, I think that's a legitimate question. I
Sure.
mean, you gave away these territories. They could secede whenever they wanted. How can you now claim them? That's a legitimate question. It's not saying you're bad or you're a bad guy or anything like that. It's just, this seems to be irregular. It must be an explanation for it, I think he could have asked that, because that's really the central question here.
Sure. And it probably implied in that is that Khrushchev thought that these states would always be united.
Yes.
That, you couldn't possibly leave, because then that would put the Red Fleet having a base in a foreign country, which, as Americans, we know that that's how Guantanamo exists in Cuba.
Yes.
It's an unusual situation.
Yes.
But it could happen.
Yes, but I mean, it would be Guantanamo is, I think, American territory. I think.
Right, but it's asserted, not
Yes.
accepted by the Cubans. It was a
Yeah,
treaty that they were
yes.
bullied
But
into.
also, if Ukraine joined NATO, and this is what I understand about his, if we can get into that too, his conflict with Ukraine is that it would be having Russian ships in our Norfolk, Virginia, or San Diego naval bases. You know, you'd have NATO ships pulling up right next to Russian ships, you know, and Ukrainian ships, and you know, that I understand.
Well, we've already run into this with Turkey, I think, in the last couple of years, in which Turkey ordered the S-400s from Russia, which are designed to shoot down the Joint Strike Fighter, which are housed in Turkey.
Yes.
So Turkey was they held both
Yes.
weapons, and they got into trouble about that a bit. But Turkey is always going to carve its own path. That's a different conversation.
Yes.
He accuses Stalin of human rights violations, which I thought was the mildest thing you could possibly say.
It's like saying,
Mao was occasionally upset.
the lowest figure, according to Russians, is 20 million for Stalin, and the high figure is 60 million.
Of which 10 million were Ukrainians.
He also glossed, he didn't even mention that. And that's significant too, because maybe there was a bad taste in the mouths of the Ukrainians
A very
for Russia.
mild way of putting it.
You know,
say after 10 million people.
that my grandfather was starved to death by Stalin and, effectively declared a war on the Ukraine because they were resisting his communist state. His nationalization of the farms and everything, and the collectivization of the farms, and so he decided to kill them off, and that's why, again, we'll get into that later, the Nazi thing. That's why when the Germans came into Ukraine, the Ukrainians were very happy to receive them, thinking that they would be free of Russia, and the Russians having starved them to death. And that's why they were enthusiastic to see the Germans. But it is true that the Germans treated the Ukrainians badly, and the Ukrainians eventually turned on them. But but that's, it goes way back. And any Ukrainians that I have talked to detest the Russians. It's not a big happy family, by any means.
Right.
As he presented it, that this was really the same people, and Ukraine in Russian means people at the borders. It doesn't really mean a people. It's just the whole picture was something that this really belongs to Russia. It's as if he didn't say this, but as if one of the United States went rogue, and now we're going to get it back into the family, kind of thing.
Well, I think what's interesting is towards the end of the interview, he talks about the fact that the world is changing all the time, and that he accuses the United States of not changing with the times and still thinking it's the Cold War. And I agree with that to a great extent. But what he hasn't realized is Ukraine has changed as well. One of the things I noticed in traveling to a lot of the countries that border Russia is when I would meet Ukrainians, a lot of them refugees, and we would talk about this, I ran into, for example, a Ukrainian translator who said, I won't translate Russian anymore. And our family, we won't speak Russian anymore. She said, my parents, their Ukrainian's not good, but they're trying. Mm-hmm. And you just think, what kind of shift has to happen in a people where they're abandoning the language that they normally speak as a form of protest? And this is happening all throughout. I've met other Ukrainians who said they're doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. So whatever may have been the case prior to now, he has certainly succeeded in creating a Ukrainian nationality where one may not have existed before.
Yes. He. I also think that he has effectively declared war in that country. He calls it the special military operation, which I think, oh, come on. This is war. You're killing civilians. You're bombing civilian targets, etc. Women and children are dying because of what you're doing, not to mention all the soldiers on both sides. You're making life miserable for these people. He just painted Russia in such a rosy picture that I thought it was false.
Well, so coming on to your denazification point, so Stepan Bandera, he did collaborate with the Nazis. He did kill Poles and Jewish people. And he was declared a hero of Ukraine until they realized he was never a citizen of Ukraine and they canceled it. But the Banderites were part of this Nazi collaborationist group. So this goes back to, I think, his trump card, where he can say, well, we're taking care of the leftover Nazis. And because that's such a cancelable offense to support Nazism, he's trying to use that and say, well, these people, and there are probably ties between Ukrainian nationalists and some of these groups. I don't think that's disputable, but I think that's the stick he's trying to beat with it. Well, until we complete this denazification process, we can't stop the special military operation.
I mean, I don't have a lot of facts in front of me, but I would tend to say that that is a minimal influence in Ukraine. And I think when you say Nazi to Russians, they think of the Great Patriotic War, meaning World War II. And yeah, we have to get the Nazis. I think that's a ploy to get the Russians worked up about defeating this Nazi threat at our doorstep. I mean, the fact that a Jew is in charge of Ukraine, I mean, they can't have. Come on.
But you alluded to it, that they did collaborate originally because they
Yes.
saw an opportunity to.
Yes.
And so that's what I think he's going to.
But there are Nazis in this country. I mean, what is he going to declare war on us because we have Nazis here?
So that's a good point. He asserts that the CIA responded to the FSB, that they were backing the opposition in the Caucasus in the 2000s. He noted that Boris Johnson torpedoed the Ukrainians from taking a deal a year and a half ago, so the war would have been over in 6 months potentially, and that Nord Stream was blown up by the CIA, and he asks cui bono, and we know that the U.S. has very large LNG facilities, liquefied natural gas, but at a much higher rate, so that Europe can pay for higher liquefied natural gas instead of getting the cheap gas that comes from Russia. So he is asserting all of these interferences in his country, the CIA supporting coups, the Boris Johnson torpedoing a deal, the fact that Nord Stream was blown up. He said, why would we blow up our own pipeline? That doesn't make any sense.
That's true. No, I think that his criticism of the West was well taken. I agreed with him practically 100% on that. That he said that Russia was, after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that it was, for the next 10 years or so, expecting the collaboration with the West. He even said, he asked Clinton if Russia could join NATO, and a negative response came back. And I think that's true because, I traveled to Russia in 2008, I think it was, or 2007. And yes, the atmosphere was totally normal. I mean, it was not you got a feeling of just an ordinary European country. And then I went again in 2011. Same thing. It was there was no hostility toward Americans or anything like that. But then things began to sour badly after that. And I do think that the West drove Russia into the hands of China. I think the West has had a horrid international politics for the past 8 decades or more. Just awful, just shameful. And that includes ourselves and Western Europe, but mostly ourselves. And I think our government has been rotten and stinking since maybe Herbert Hoover died. Right.
Well, and the strategy isn't working. You talked about driving them into the arms of China. He noted that Russia has gone from doing 3% of their transactions in yuan to 34%. And the sanctions that have been put on him, he said, have driven Russia to be Europe's #1 economy during this time, that everyone else is getting hit so hard as a result, but Russia is still managing. Now, how much of that is propaganda and how much of that is true? Russia is struggling through this situation, but they seem to be struggling keeping their head above water.
And the stupidity of the United States, and I'm talking about our leadership. Do you want to fight a nuclear war with Russia and China as allies? Do you know how many nuclear weapons that is? Russia has more nuclear weapons than anybody. China has a lot of nuclear weapons. Do we want to face the billions of people in China and all of the nuclear arsenal of Russia as an enemy? Do you think Europe is going to help us? I mean, they're just busy eating and enjoying life. Europe would just shrink at that. They would just say, well, we don't want to get involved. I mean, the stupidity of our government, it just shows the failure of democracy.
Well, he points out, he said, don't you all have things to do? He said, do you really want to come? He said, thousands of miles from your own border. You have a border situation. You have, he called it $33 trillion of debt.
Yes.
Do you think that this is what you want to be doing with your time, is getting into a war with Russia?
Right.
And I think that was a great open question. We got to it, this is late, it was probably an hour and 45 minutes into the interview. That's a question I think should have been posed early on, which is that what America wants? Do you want to get into a war with Russia over this country?
We are playing with fire there. We really are. We're poking the dragon.
Did you believe him? This is asked again towards the end of the interview. We have no interest in Poland or Latvia. What do they have that we need? Do you believe that he has no extraterritorial interests as well?
Yeah, I do believe that. I do believe that that it would be an obvious aggression on their part. I tend to believe that they don't have any sights on those countries.
He said only if Poland attacked us first.
Yeah.
And the likelihood of that is low.
Yes, I think he's telling the truth there.
I was thinking about our moment in Krakow last summer, in which our taxi driver had told us we had passed a monument, and I'd asked about it, and then I think we asked, if you had to choose between a Russian and a German, who would you shoot first? And he says, it would be a tough decision. He didn't know who he was going to shoot first.
I think he said he would shoot them both, right?
Yeah, something like that. but the dynamics in that part of Europe are fraught and difficult. But the idea that, especially with everything that's going on, that would be a priority of his to invade Poland, a NATO country, invoking Article 5. I just don't see that this man sitting in that chair who talks like this for 2 hours is then going to say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invade a NATO country. And I think part of it, Your Excellency, is he needed to invade Ukraine before it became a NATO country. Mm-hmm. Because if it was a NATO country, then...
Yes, Article 5. Yes. No, I understand that. I see. I've been criticizing him a great deal. On the other hand, I understand his objections to the direction of Ukraine. Having in your backyard NATO bases. NATO is an anti-Russian treaty. In other words, it's a group of well-armed nations who are against Russia. That's the whole purpose of NATO. And have that in your backyard with NATO bases, I agree with him that would be intolerable for Russia. And I think Ukraine was very, very foolish in listening to the West and getting lured by the West into becoming a Western European country. Ukraine, it is true, has always been culturally and religiously, et cetera, tied to Russia for many, many centuries, since the 1650s. And they, even after 1991, Russia was giving them free gas because they couldn't pay their bills. I remember that in the 1990s, that Ukraine was and so Russia, I understand that this, it's something that had, and he said that we always had a good relationship, a close relationship with Ukraine. I understand that. And the idea of having hostile bases in your backyard is, just as we would not tolerate having.
We didn't back when you were a younger.
When I was 12 years old. All right.
To refresh that for our listeners.
Yes, and no, but you see, it was a little different. Is we were prepared for war with Russia at the time. In other words, it was not a war with Cuba. We weren't going to occupy Cuba. We were going to block the Russian missiles, and they had to take out the missiles that they had there, and they would be inspected by American ships, etc. But we were on the brink of nuclear war with Russia. I remember it. I mean, everyone was very scared. And it turns out, I read a book later, that at the time, Russia had the capability of delivering only one nuclear missile.
But one would have been enough.
So, well, it's still, not done the job, I don't think.
Right.
And they would have been flattened, in a matter of minutes. That's when they had, the Strategic Air Command flying close to Russia all the time, ready to attack Moscow at any time. So in other words, at the time though, it wasn't an invasion of Cuba that we were thinking about. It was Russia that was our problem. And I think that instead of invading Ukraine, he should have said to the United States, look, I'm not going to tolerate this, and you got to pull out of this. And, we also have to remember that all of the corruption in Ukraine and all of the Biden connections to Ukraine, all the money, and, that this is, a factor too, that why is it Ukraine and, not some other country? And I think, yes, I think that the West has the dirtiest politics imaginable with regard to this whole thing. And really, as I said, poke the dragon of Russia. And now we're paying the price. And really, Ukraine is paying the price, but so are we. A lot of money has been going over there, money that we don't have, because we're $33 trillion in debt, and it's going up as we speak. So money, we're borrowing money to give it to Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, that has to come to collapse one day.
I feel like that video is not circulated enough in which Joe Biden is bragging, back when he was able to brag and complete a sentence, that he held back funding for Ukraine until the public prosecutor was fired, who was chasing down his son and the whole situation.
Yes.
Talk about interference in another country.
Yes, and quid pro quo.
Right, exactly.
Remember, they accused Trump of that.
So with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I suppose something else I appreciate about is they used both a military and a diplomatic solution. We only found out years later in Bobby Kennedy's memoir about the situation that the U.S. traded the Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey as a swap. They couldn't do it at the time, but they said in 6 months they have to be replaced anyway, and we won't put new ones back in. Right. But if the public had found out, they said if it finds out, we can. And the Russians didn't say anything, and those missiles were removed. But that was part of the, hey, if you're going to put missiles in Turkey, we're going to put missiles in Cuba, which is not an unreasonable idea. Again,
it's true.
If you're in an adversarial relationship.
It's true.
Up until this point, NATO in 5 waves has kept putting missiles aimed at Russia, but they say, well, it's an Iranian threat, it has nothing to do with you. And he said, okay, well, why don't we develop a system together in which we can share this technology and we'll counter the Iranian threat. Oh, no, that's okay. Okay, well, if you do that, I'm going to have to develop my own technology. Okay. And he develops this hypersonic missile, which he bragged about, which is true. No one has this technology. Russia has the best hypersonic weapons around. We created that scenario because we wouldn't allow him to cooperate, because that would foil the problem of Russia has to be the big bad wolf here.
No, as I said, the international politics of the United States has been a degrading and absolutely disgusting thing since probably Herbert Hoover.
So we've been discussing realpolitik and history up to this point, but the point that you've consistently made up through from the very first discussion we had about this very early on, I think in 2022, when I interviewed you about this for Roman Catholic Media, was we cannot as Catholics countenance an invasion of a sovereign territory. And in this particular phase of the war, we're talking about this move. The way that Putin framed it in the interview is that this conflict is from 2014 relating to the coup, that the CIA-backed coup in the Maidan effectively suspended Ukraine as a legitimate country, and since Ukraine wouldn't implement Minsk 1 and 2, which included giving back Donbass, and he said, I don't know how we would convince them, but we would try to convince them to go back under Ukraine. Ukraine has said that they will not implement Minsk. He says, well, since that conflict from 2014 was never resolved, I'm resuming hostilities. So he sees this as a continuation of 2014 conflict. Do you accept that characterization, and would you modify what you were saying about the 2022 invasion?
Again, I understand Russia's objections, but the central question is Ukraine a sovereign state, a sovereign country? And does it have territory that belongs to it? He took over Crimea with what was known as little green men, which means that he lied. that they were really Russian soldiers. Everybody knew it, but he said, no, they're not Russian soldiers. Yeah, so there's a history of lying here. Again, it was given by Khrushchev to Ukraine. You can't take something back which you've given. And Ukraine had it for since the 1950s, which is a long time. And it's not as if it happened yesterday or something like that. So I think that's the central question. No matter what you object to about Ukraine, you can't walk into somebody else's territory and just take it. According to moral theology, you would have to give an ultimatum to someone, and you would have to declare war. So you can't go shooting people and killing people without a declaration of war. He didn't do that. He was even this. The special military operation. Come on, this is war, and he is killing people, and it's against all moral theology with regard to war, the rules of war. Also, he is targeting civilian targets. In other words, he's apartment houses and things like that. He's not confining himself to and I don't think those are merely mistakes, or he is attacking places that are inhabited by civilians with his drones and whatnot, and that's immoral. Seriously immoral.
I think it was a real missed opportunity from Tucker's part not to come back to the original thread that he started the interview with, to pose the question that you just posed, which is Ukraine a sovereign territory, and do you not see a problem with this? What if Estonia invaded, or what if Finland invaded this part of Russia? Because as we know from World War II, there is a large part of historic Finland that is sitting inside Russia now, which the Finns still talk about, but was squeezed out of them as part of their settlement.
There are ethnic Austrians under Italian rule.
Who consider themselves Austrians, to be fair.
Yes. I mean, they speak German, and they can't stand the fact that they belong to Italy, and that was handed over to Italy as a consolation prize at Versailles, in 1919, or Paris, I should say, and there are all sorts of ethnic peoples that live under
the Hungarians who live in Romania.
Yes, there's Europe is a big a big bowl of a whole bunch of different peoples, and there were the Germans, the ethnic Germans that were living in Czechoslovakia, and then they were also living in Danzig. Danzig was a completely German city, and if you start saying, well, we're going to take this because it's German, and that because it's German, and this because it's French, and you have war, for what?
Well, it's tied to the religion of nationalism, which I think arose, as you've taught me, as a replacement for Christianity and the way that the Pope would act as a father to all the nations. Mm-hmm. That nationalism became and that's what's happening here. Is if you buy into nationalism, then there's irredenta that has to be reclaimed and brought back in. And
you look at Yugoslavia with all of the different peoples that hated each other under the Serbs. That was given to Serbia as their consolation prize, that whole stretch of real estate. Look at the Greeks living in Turkish territory and Turks living in Greek territory. That's Europe. It's they all hate each other, but they figure this is better than war. So I just don't think that, for him to say, well, there's Russians living in Ukraine, that therefore we can invade that. I don't see that as a legitimate
I think something else, and I see this in the traditional Catholic sphere, that Putin is painted as this Christian leader. And Tucker even asks him, he says, do you see God at work in the world? And Putin's answer was, no.
No, that's not a Christian leader.
Could you imagine?
In any stretch of the imagination, he's... No, and I thought that was kind of because then he said, you're killing people in Ukraine and everything. I mean, the whole question is whether this is a justified war. Obviously, if it's a justified war, then killing people is part of the war. I thought that was a dumb question, as if Christian peoples cannot go to war for a legitimate reason. That, obviously they can. The question is this legitimate? And so I thought it was a dumb question.
But I did think it underlined the fact that he isn't thinking about Christian or Catholic just war principles. This is a realpolitik defense of Russia. He's unapologetic about it. And on that front, as you say, you understand. But as Christians, we have to step back and say, is this justified? However much we may think the West has been rotten and double dealt with everybody in the situation.
And I'm going to say the stupidity of the Ukrainians for believing the West and being lured by the West and enticed by the West and poking, again, the dragon next door, that Russia, they had to know that Russia would not be happy with what they were doing. And Russia is a big armed country, very powerful. You don't do that with big armed countries that are very powerful. I mean, it just didn't make sense for them to make this move. And I think that they backed themselves into it very unwisely.
When I interviewed you about this the first time when the war was very new, I certainly thought it would end quickly. And here we are years later, still talking about it. Do you, apart from the fact that there is going to be a fairly significant political change, Tucker was interviewed a few days later, and he said he doesn't know what's going to happen in November. He doesn't know who the candidates are going to be. Things are so up in the air that barring a major change in November in which an incoming U.S. president could move the logjam, do you see this as an ongoing frozen conflict? It has
become a trench warfare, World War I type of thing where the lines are not moving, really. You don't hear anything about any breakthroughs. That's the World War I. And yes, it's going to come to that. And I think Putin is doing the waiting game because the Allies are going to get tired of sending weapons and money to Ukraine with no results. That can only go on for so long.
Money can't buy you humans to fight a war. It can only buy you weapons. You still have to have people who are trained to use those weapons. And then when those people get killed, you can't replace them except with NATO soldiers.
Yes, and Russia has a big arsenal of weapons and has a lot of capabilities. And it's not a real match, to Russia against Ukraine, And so the West will get tired of all of that. And then Ukraine will have to come to terms with Russia. And I think they'll lose the Donbass and they'll lose Crimea. I think they will. It's because Russia will be able to dictate all the terms.
And I think those terms will be that they can't join the EU and they can't join NATO, or one or the other. You can join the EU but not NATO. And
I don't think they want NATO. They might go for the EU, but I don't think they want NATO because they have the EU at their other borders too.
Well, and he noted before that when Yushchenko, one of the presidents, was considering, well, should we take this EU deal because it would exclude us from our Russian trade because Russia would have to close their customs borders. And he was actually weighing it, and that's when the coup, gained momentum, that he was actually considering, well, should I join the EU or should I deal with Russia? I don't think the Russian-Ukrainian trade balance is going to ramp back up after this.
No, I just think it was very unwise for Ukraine in the long run to irritate Russia. I really do. And I think they're paying a very high price for it right now. And I don't think they're going to succeed in their goals.
So I think the last message I want to make sure it's clear, Your Excellency, is apart from whatever the complexities of the situation or where our own personal sympathies lie, as Christians, we have to look at the question of just war and whether you can invade a sovereign state like this. And you've said over and over that Russia could not do this.
If it's a sovereign state, you have to have a casus belli. There is a cause for war, and the war has to be. There should be an ultimatum. There should be and then a declaration of war, and then you should confine yourself only to military targets. But first of all, is there a casus belli? Is there a cause for war here? That could be discussed. As I said, I'm sympathetic with the Russian complaints here. But on the other hand, I'm not sympathetic with their painting of Ukraine as some sort of rogue Russian state that needs to be taken back. Mm-hmm. I don't agree with that.
Well, we can't promise that we'll have interviews like this very frequently, watchers and listeners. It was just something that was unprecedented that I think His Excellency thought merited, and certainly I agreed, some discussion. Thank you for sharing and pointing out the questions that should have been asked and underlining some of the history that was glossed over by
Yes,
President
that's a
Putin.
nice word for it. Yeah.
As always, if you liked this video, please feel free to like and share it with people who are interested in this conflict or interested in a Catholic view on world events in general. Feel free to send a super thanks if you'd like to continue to support the seminary. And as always, Your Excellency, thank you for your time.
Thank you.